got something right in the middle of mine. I hope that will go. Well, first of all, thanks for letting me do this. You know, it's I really thoroughly enjoy the presentations that I've been, you know, I've sat through. I'm not a collector. I think I might have told somebody before, but what I do is I do love the history of the group and the presentations. It's just my way of saying thanks, really, and I appreciate you allowing me to do that. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to talk about the history of the Royal Naval Reserve in London, and it's kind of like quite an extensive period. So I'm not going to go through the whole of the history. It's just going to take a small chunk. We may, if I don't talk too much, touch on the First World War, but basically what I'm looking at is a social side of it, the way society reacted within it, and just how the military is or was as a part of our culture. Now, sailors' reserves in the UK, actually, it's not a new thing at all. Right back to Drake's time, something like 70% of the ship's companies on the Armada were volunteer sailors, they were landsmen. Yeah, and so it's not an uncommon practice, or it didn't used to be a particularly uncommon practice, but it didn't really get formalized as a reserve organization until the late 1700s. And I think it's important that everybody that we understand our roots, and it was formed by the name, as it says there, the Corps of River Fencibles, and there was a City of London group, and there were a number of groups around the country, and they were basically Thames Watermen. Now, the Thames Watermen as an organisation exists as a part of the Honourable Company of Watermen, and that uniform that you see on the left-hand side is still worn in London during ceremonial occasions. So what did they do? Well, to be fair, during that period of time, they didn't do a particularly great deal. They managed the boat, sailed the boats for Nelson's funeral. They, in fact, actually, I don't know if you're aware of this, but over here we have carnivals, and even though carnivals are vehicles, they're all buses and vans that go along, and carts and stuff. They're called floats, and the reason they're called floats is because in those days all the carnivals were on the water, and the floats were, of course, the boats that went through. In 1807, they were used to go to Copenhagen to bring back some Danish vessels that we'd captured. And in 1812, they were actually formed a part of a press gang. Now, there's a lot said about press gangs in our history, but to be perfectly frank, there's two things I would like to say. One, they weren't used prolifically. In fact, during the whole time of the Fencibles, they only managed to press 200 people. But also as well, the Navy as it was then wasn't really interested in landsmen. It was only really interested in sailors. And so they particularly focused on people who were seamen anyway. Not that that's an excuse, of course, not that that's an excuse. So that organisation folded, and there was seen little use for it. The political situation was different. And then in 1853 was the beginning, really, of the organisation as we know it now, the Royal Naval Coastal Volunteers. And they were coast watchers, simple as that, coast watchers. And it was all about defence of the rivers, the Medway, the Thames, and some of the other rivers further up north in Newcastle and the Glasgow and Edinburgh. And they worked with the Navy, but they weren't really a part of it. Okay, they did do some seamanship training, and they did go out on small boats, and they enlisted for 5 years at a time. Now it says there, and it is quite correct, to serve more than 300 miles, but that was only in time of conflict. In peacetime, they were never expected to go more than 150 miles away from British coastal waters. The painting there is again, it's at Woolwich Arsenal, and it's the ferry, it's the Fishguard. Basically, it was an administration centre, and that was the focus for London of the volunteers. Now, again, as I said, it kind of forms out. Now, the Royal Naval Reserve today has to conduct 28 training days per year, and the training and so that hasn't changed hardly at all from those days. And nowadays, the 28 days can be a combination of drill nights where they attend in London one evening a week or more, perhaps weekends, and a fortnight away, sometimes more. Sometimes you can go away for months, and if you're mobilised, of course, then you can go away for quite an extensive period of time. Yeah, and so again, they got paid. They got a £6 bonus or bounty, which again is something that the Royal Naval Reserve get today. More than £6. It's nearly £2,000 now. The bonus. Now here's a couple of photographs. The battle honours. Their only battle honours was the Crimean War. There's a photograph of Crimea, which is again probably quite topical at the moment. And on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, there's 3 members of the RCV who served in the Crimean War and obviously were awarded their medals and had some photographs taken. So, right, where are we now? That after that organisation faded into obscurity. The trouble is, you see, there's 2 sides to this. You're getting there's the political argument and there's the military argument. Naturally, the Admiralty want as many sailors and as many warships as it can have, and conversely, the politicians don't particularly want to spend any money, so they'll give them there'll be some sort of halfway ground. And once you lose something, once you lose an organisation, it's much more difficult to get back, as you'll find out in the gap after the Royal Naval Artillery Volunteers. Now, there's a photograph of some of the artillery chaps. They basically simply were what it said on the tin, right? Basic seamanship skills. So the chaps in the RNCV would have migrated over to the artillery volunteers. Now they did exactly what it said on the tin. There's a painting of somebody of that vintage, and they were you can still see plenty of photographs of people of old British sailors doing cutlass drills and so on. But they were trained, and I think a lot of this actually stemmed from the relief of Ladysmith when the field gunners carried the guns across. They felt there was a need, and so they were trained on the basic weapon skills that they thought would be needed in that day. And remember, gunnery wasn't as sophisticated as it is now. So yeah, they had to append drills. Now here you're going to see an example of what I consider to be the first element of snobbery within the military as it was then. They really objected to calling to considering these chaps as sailors or seamen, as reservists. And so they used the term efficient. So you were not a sailor, you couldn't be in the Royal Navy. It was an ordinary seaman, able seaman, leading seaman, and so on. Regardless of your branch, my branch was a logistician, but we're all addressed in a very similar way. But the Royal Naval gunnery, the artillery volunteers, they didn't afford them that privilege, and they were just known as efficients. Okay. And or trained men if they did the extra courses. Oh, that's the complement there. I forgot about that. 66 in 1891, there were 66 officers and 1,800 ratings, and that's not bad, I don't think. They must have got some enjoyment out of that to have spent that time. Now, just when you thought it got complicated, I'm going to mention the Royal Naval Reserve. The Royal Naval Reserve is a separate, in 1900, was a separate organisation to what we're talking about now. Basically, it was made up of professional seamen and retired RM personnel. So if you're a merchant Navy officer, you could enlist in the Royal Naval Reserve. You wouldn't necessarily have to do an awful lot. You would get paid a retainer, but you would stay on their books. If you're ex-Royal Navy as an officer or ex-Royal Navy as a rating, you would just automatically be deferred over to a class reserve. In current times now, if you leave the Royal Navy, you have 3 years on the reserve list. The first year is known as a special class reserve, and then the latter, which means you can go any time they particularly want you. But the other two classes are, it's more or less an order of priority. But the reason I wanted to show you these photos was quite simply, you may recognise the one on the left, Jack Hawkins from the Cruel Sea. I've used that photo because it denotes the insignia. So when you see these old black and white films, you'll see a British warship and it's got all these different officers wearing different bands. They all come from different walks of life, maritime life. And that scramble, that wiggly three lines there, that's there. He would have, in real life, would have been a professional seaman. Captain Smith, which some of you might recognize from the Titanic, which unfortunately is also quite apt at the moment. He was also a Royal Naval Reserve officer, and you can tell that by looking at his medals. As his first medal on his chest there, that's the one on the left, is the Reserve decoration. So he too had signed up to be a Royal Naval Reserve. Okay, now we're going to get to us. This is where it really starts to change, and this is the modern Royal Naval Reserve as we exist at the moment. 1903. There was about 5 years of argument in Parliament about producing whether they wanted to have a reserve force or not. Remember, at this period of time, 12 years, there were no naval reserves. The Admiralty was saying, we're desperate, we need a backup. I mean, as I'm sure you will all know, that a warship has two complements. It has a peacetime complement and then a wartime complement. And so the reserves were initially designed to plug that gap. It's different now, but it was initially designed to plug that gap. But anyway, and Hansard's reflects this. There was much debate in Parliament, and in the end, they capitulated. Vote went through. It was pushed through, and in 1903, the Naval Forces Act initiated, the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. Now, the chap on the left you probably won't recognise, but you might have drunk some of his beer, and I'll explain that in a moment. On the 17th of August 1903. HMS President was commissioned. The first appointment was Rupert Guinness, a member of the Guinness family. So, which was quite handy, which was quite fortunate, really, because the Navy didn't actually give the RNVR very much money in the early days, which you'll see. He was actually the second officer. There was two members. The other one is the Marquis of Graham, and because of the alphabetically, he was second. He was acknowledged as the second officer to join the Royal Naval Reserve. Again, initially, all changed. So it was made up of civilians. You didn't have to have ex-naval knowledge. Anyone could say, I want to join it. If you had a passion for the sea and you really enjoyed you wanted to make a career, and you could make a career, you could sign on. So in September 1903, at Fishmongers Hall, which is in the photograph now, just by London Bridge, I think it is. In fact, it's sadly better known for a terrorist activity, action that took place there. That building was where the first recruiting took place for the Royal Naval Reserve. The first drill ship was in 1903, and there it is, HMS Gallet. And it was based at East India Dock, which is where the cursor is now. Sorry, West India Dock in London. It was initially an administration centre for the RNR, okay, but then it got overwhelmed. It became the training centre for the Royal Naval Reserve. But fortunately for everyone, not particularly long. Now, interestingly enough, this ship was saved by Chatham Historic Dockyard and restored, and that's what she looks like now. So she was taken back to a Victorian state before she was used. She'd been used for many things, the coaler, training ship, and all sorts of bits. I think she was being used as a jetty when they finally discovered her in Kent, and she was taken towed to Chatham, and many years restored back to her original condition, which I think is absolutely fantastic. So, new volunteers. Okay, again, as before, they'd accept they would go to war anywhere. It was different there, and in essence, they would serve under the conditions of what we call the Naval Discipline Act, which is also known as the Queen's, or the King's Rules and Regulations, Royal Navy. Although that didn't happen initially, that actually came. I've included it here now because it wasn't very long. But initially, they weren't under the Naval Discipline Act, and the Royal Navy found it really quite frustrating because if they did something that they shouldn't have done, they were a little bit naughty when they couldn't be punished. So when they got back to President, what they used to do is make them stand in the corner. So that was it. And basically they were first ones to be considered not quite 100% on the same footing as their regular counterparts a lot closer than the previous organisations. And that was the first training ship, HMS Buzzard. Give you a little bit of geography. That's Blackfriars Bridge. That's the embankment. That's the Temple Chambers, where all the centre of London's legal profession is. And that was our training ship. You might notice there's a bit of a gap. Well, what used to happen was the old chaps would come out of the Temple when they'd finished their day's work, walk across the embankment, and there was a dustbin lid here. And they used to whack it with a stick. And there'd be a little man here who would wait for that. And when he heard that there was somebody wanting to come across, he'd come down this accommodation ladder onto one of these Liberty boats and row it across. And that's all he would do all drill night, wait for someone to bash a dustbin. And that was in June 1904 that ship arrived. There's a couple of pictures of the inside of it. That's the armory. I don't think they particularly modified it. Obviously, it was just before my time, so I don't quite remember it. But they, they don't think they particularly modified it, but they didn't need to. Training was basic, seamanship was basic, and we'd only really just started to get an introduction into wireless and communications. There's another one there. Maxim gun, doing some gun drills on the deck, and you can see there's the embankment on the left-hand side there. And I'm now going to just run through a few photographs of the lads doing some basic seamanship training and boat drills. And there they were. So they had plenty of opportunity. And trust me, having been on the Thames, it's got some really fierce tides. And so, if you're doing boat drill on there, you really want to make sure you got the tide right. Otherwise, you could end up in the channel before long. Okay, so as I said, I may have said already that the Admiralty wasn't particularly generous. £4 a year. My grandfather, his brother, got pinched by the police in 1833 for letting off fireworks. He got fined 2 shillings. I did some calculations. His dad was on 15 shillings a week. So basically they got 6 weeks of working man's wage, 6 weeks working man wage for the organizational costs of the unit, of the ship. So now you see a better photograph of Mr. Guinness, of Captain Guinness, or Commander Guinness. You'll see why that money came in handy, because here, another photograph, another image of the Thames, this inverted L, he paid for that. He paid for that. So the ship, there's the Temple Chambers there. The ship was, that's Blackfriars Bridge. The ship was there, and the shed, if you like, that was used for artillery training, paid for by Guinness. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had it. And this is what they looked like inside. Apparently, it used to frighten the people to death. They went up and down the river because they'd opened the side of the building, and these guns would poke out. It used to, drive them a little bit crazy. So there's some photographs there you might see, and they were dated. The guns were dated. They used to do some seamanship training there as well, of course. As you can see, top right, the boat work. The guns were quite dated, all right, but this is all about preparing and gun drills, and they were all they weren't particularly sophisticated in those days, and so much easier for them to move up. A couple more photographs there, all right. One, as you can see there, one of the guns poking out across the Thames. That's the one on the left. The one on the right, interestingly, is a 25-pounder field gun. Very similar to the gun used at the relief of Mafeking. And I don't know if you're aware of it, but in the UK, we used to have something called the field gun race, or the field gun run, where the different groups of sailors from different units, there was one from Portsmouth, Plymouth, Fleet Air Arm, used to race against each other and on obstacles. If you ever get a chance to watch a film of the field gun run on the YouTube, then do it. It's really quite interesting. They don't do it now, I'm afraid. Like Defence Cuts, it goes now. We do something called brickwood field gun, which is on the flat. But the big one, the major one, that's been done away with. Okay. They were nicknamed, the sailors in London were nicknamed the Blackfriars Buccaneers because of their locations. Again, still called efficients. I've put that photograph there on the right-hand side of some rank slides just to show you again, there are different, once again, it becomes more complicated. There are different ranks. Training was limited. Okay, and you didn't need to have to do very much. Okay, you really didn't have to do an awful lot to qualify. So the expectations of these lads were quite low, unless they were communicators, of course, which we'll touch on a little bit later. Okay, again, they didn't get an awful lot of money. Get rid of this. All right, okay. I'll move that. I've got something going on, but I'll get rid of it up there. Uniforms free uniforms. So, you know, nowadays everything's free. You get a kit, you get a kit issue, you can exchange kit. I mean, you know, you can't, but them days, so, you know, you're looking at someone who's probably earning 20 shillings a week, a working lad. That's £1 a week. And so he's got to buy his shoes out of that and his oilskins. I mean, I'm sure they bought them, swapped them amongst each other, but not cheap. Officers, as they are now, given a financial grant. Nowadays, it's about £700, I think, something like that, but it still doesn't meet the cost of their needs. Right, okay. No pay and allowances, but they did get a grant, 35 shillings a week. That's £1.75, nearly $2 in your money. And if they don't meet, they give it back. There wasn't an awful lot given. It wasn't, you know, it was the Navy on the cheap, as I guess the reserves still are. Okay, so a couple of photographs. Gun-X Eastbourne, they used to go away on the coast and use the guns. They still had the guns from the Royal Naval Artillery Volunteers, and they used to use them. And there are some reports of activities and some news reports in newspapers of them working down there. And on the left-hand side, I've put in a photograph of HMS Dreadnought, because all midshipmen, just like their regular counterparts, had to write a journal, okay, a midshipman's journal. And one journal I went through and read, it demonstrates this young lad, a young fella, who did his fortnight on a ship in Portsmouth, and he described the Dreadnought, and I thought it would just be a quite nice prompt to put that in there. And by the way, there is a book I've got, if anyone wants it, I've got a PDF that I can share with you on the whole history of the R&R, which I'm actually skimming quite a bit. It might not feel like it. And if you are interested, let me have an email address and I'll share it with you. Okay, drill nights. So they did drill nights as before. The crest on the right-hand side is a little bit different to the crest at the beginning when we entered, because the ship was in the square mile, what's known as a square mile, which is the City of London. And so therefore it was entitled to that crest of the cross of St. George with the sword is the crest of the City of London. And so that was embedded in their ship's crest. And the left-hand side is another photograph of one of the companies. Okay, now this is when it gets fun. I think this is funny. Perhaps other people don't necessarily see it this way. In 1908, the Admiralty agrees to fund lighting during drill hours. So they wouldn't, remember, they paid for nothing up until there. Commander Guinness, who was a part owner of a massive brewing company, was not allowed to sign off the use of the electricity. He couldn't authorize it. It had to be done by a petty officer who was in the RN. So there you go. Okay, they were then changed. They became divisions. Each division was subdivided again, and finally in 1909 they dropped the term efficients and non-efficients, which I think was probably one of the most. If you look at the photo on the right, you can see there that the Liberty boat actually going across from the ship to the embankment, which is yeah. Okay, now this is again something interesting. Now most reserves nowadays, as a reservist, if you go away for a fortnight, you actually get paid for it. You wouldn't do unless you're doing something particularly adventurous training or something like that. Well, in them days, they had something called pay to stay. So you would get lads who would, or fellas who were working in the Temple or working anywhere in London, and they'd go to work on a Monday, yeah, and they'd do their day's work. And instead of going home, they'd have their kit with them and they'd go to President. They'd go to the ship and they would move on board for the night. They'd do naval duties. They'd sleep on board and they'd do duties in the morning. I've got a couple of examples to show you in a minute. And then they go back to work, and they could do that for a fortnight, but they had to pay for that. So instead of the Navy paying them, they had to pay the Navy for the privilege. And during, of course, their time there, they were trained on all the other aspects of, you know, so they had to pay for their electricity, pay for their food, and pay for everything else for the privilege of being trained. Just to give you a better example, on the right-hand side, you've got more examples of the ranks and the wavy lace My branch is the bottom one there, because I'm a member of the Supply and Secretariat branch. And the white lace identifies that. The red lace and orange lace is medical and dental. Here you go. Have a look through that. So you'd get up in the morning at 20 to, what's that, 5:40, 20 to 6. And then you'd call the hands, lash and stow. The duty part of the watch would fall in. They'd have boat work. They would get the boats on the river, and at 7:45, 7:45, they go to breakfast. So that was their daily routine. Before they would then, once they'd had breakfast, go back down to their mess deck, get changed into their civils, wait for a Liberty boat so they could go back onto the embankment and go to work. So they'd have a day at work, whatever they were doing. They might be working the table. They could be a bus driver. They could be working in a pub. Could be anything, right? They could be whatever they're doing, working in an office. So they do their 9 hours, 8 hours, and then they'd come back down to prison, bash on that dustbin lid, get collected, and then they'd get on board, get changed into their naval uniform, and that would be their evening routine. And so they would go, and that would carry on for a fortnight. So where were we? Yeah, so that was the ship's complement. The comms, I've asterisked the bottom as different trades. I've asterisked it because the Royal Naval Wireless Volunteer was something that was a slightly different organisation. It basically was a fast-moving organisation. Comms had just come in. I mean, when did Titanic go down? 1980. So it was really a new thing that was getting brought into warships. And when as I'll talk to you in a moment, the mobilisation took place for the Great War, comms were the only ones that were guaranteed to go to war in ships. Okay, this is the big promise. Churchill, this is Churchill inspecting the division on the Temple Gardens. Every year, the HMS President has an annual division, a big parade. And when we were in London, when we were in the city of London, it always took place on the Temple Chambers. In my day, they weren't too worried about footwear, but I'm looking at that photograph and I'm thinking perhaps they didn't want all these horrible sailors traipsing over the Temple Gardens in hobnail boots. But the most important thing is that Churchill promised the reserves, and there was about 5 or 6 different groups then, that they would go to sea if they were mobilised. Remember, this was 1913. There was a lot of politics going on. They were promised that they would go to sea. That wasn't necessarily the case. Churchill's promise was broken, and he formed what was known as the Royal Naval Division. And basically, with a few exceptions, as I've said already, the communicators, and there were a few other specialist branches, all the Royal Naval Reserves and the R&R and all the seamen, the fishermen from Ireland and Scotland, all these, they were all lumped together and formed an army, what you could call an army division. They weren't. I'm not going to go into the detail of it. But they frustrated the army because they operated in a very nautical fashion. All right, and so they didn't accept the same sort of systems and routines as the army. But they fought quite gallantly. In fact, they were the most decorated military group, division, regiment in the British Army during the Great War. They were everywhere. There were eight. In fact, after the initial mobilisation, they were recruiting for the division. There were eight in all. There was Howe, Hood, and but Collingwood, as you'll see on there, was actually disbanded. The Collingwood division was disbanded because of something I'm going to talk to you about in a minute, and they used all of Collingwood to fill the gaps that were created by what happened in Antwerp. They did their training in Deal. Okay, they did their training in Deal, and there's the photographs. These are latter ones because initially they went out, they were dressed as sailors, they weren't dressed in khaki. Basically what happened was, and this is meant quite a deal to them, you know, they were really upset, and they did this ceremony in Lambeth, which is the one at the south of the river, where they actually took the marlin spike and had a funeral procession and buried it. All right. And there was a sort of modest ceremony, if you like, but it was just their way of showing their disgust. And then, just like you'd expect, once they'd done that, they turned around and went off to war. You know, this photograph was taken just after that ceremony, and it was in, these were the lads that were now with their kit bags. As you can see, you know, these were the first ones to go down to do their army training. There's no khaki uniforms there. Latterly, they did get issued it. They went down in blues in their sailors' uniform and get issued it. As again, I've got a couple of excerpts from letters that you can look at. Hope I'm not going on too long, but so there they are. There they muster in there, and that's in Lambeth, waiting to be taken down to Deal. On the right hand side is the leading hand who's doing the check-in on that chap there. On the left, that small photograph there, a little bit of an irrelevance, but not to the Royal Naval Division, was taken at Crystal Palace. The Crystal Palace was converted into a Royal Naval Division training ground and a wireless training ground. Some of these chaps here were people who had signed up. They weren't necessarily reservists, the ones in civvies. They'd signed up to join the RND. I'm just have a quick look through here. Okay, Jim Burgent was one of the first to go down. He was from London. He went down. He drove down. He went down to Chatham, and from Chatham, he went to Deal eventually. And it's just a snippet from a letter he sent home. I mean, some of the runs ashore. I mean, I've done a lot of research on this over the years, and some of the runs ashore weren't quite so placid. You know, there are reports of sailors getting drunk and removing one-armed bandits, and you know, the slot machines, and pinch them and take them down there. You know, so they had a lot of drinking and a lot of high spirits. But I don't think this chap was quite like that. And then he sent another letter, you know, where he told his niece that he actually felt he was going to, you know, he was going to go abroad. And that's basically when very much how they knew when they found out how it was going to happen. And as I've said, they didn't like it, but they got on with it. You know, what more can you say? And there's another photograph again. Latterly, they still kept their flat caps. In a moment, I'll show you some photographs from Antwerp, where their first action. They was only in Belgium 3 days before they the first attack against the Germans. And these lads here, obviously some of the first ones that went down, still got their blue, you know, their blue sailor number 1 suit on, or not, number 2 suit on, ready to go down. And that's pretty much how they looked in the field. An easier picture to picture there. That he's you know, see it in colour. The chap on the right is a Royal Marine, the Royal Marine Light Infantry, but the one in the centre and the one on the left would have been Royal Naval Division lads. Okay, and so there's an idea what they did. You know, basically any boot camp. Yeah, a bit of drill, a bit of marching. They did some PT. They had 12-mile marches. I think even I can remember doing pretty long marches across Dartmoor. And although I'm sure my boots were a lot more comfortable than theirs were. Yeah. All right. Okay, this was the camp that they did their training in Deal, and this is them marching off. Again, it could have been any one of the groups. It was a factory producing soldiers for the front, and there they are on their ferries going across the channel. You might notice there that although the sailors look like sailors with their caps and stuff, the officers there, he was still a Royal Naval Division officer, but he was dressed in khaki. There are a few of these photos kicking about. Here they are in Ostend, I think. Yeah, Ostend, where they're marching off on those horrible boots he was talking about. And now we're going to be at the siege. Now, this photograph is of training. This is in Deal, but basically the Siege of Antwerp. Now, their first job, the Royal Naval Division. I'm not going to talk about everything that went on in the First World War, because there's lots, and you know, people can buy books on it. But this is unusual, and so I thought it was worth mentioning. Is basically their job was there was Antwerp, the city is like a walled city with little fortresses around the wall, and then there was an outside perimeter. One group of the RND was to defend the perimeter, which are these lads here, and then there were 2 of the forts on the city were to be defended by 2 subgroups of the RND. This is a training shot as well from Deal. Otherwise he wouldn't be stood there with his hands in his pockets, I shouldn't think. Again, this is the initial. It wasn't just them, by the way. I think they joined the Belgian soldiers, so I'm sure they didn't build all this in the 3 days that they were there. Here you can see the Germans advance. You can't see them. You see the smoke from the Germans advance when they were just up the road. So they, you know, they knew they weren't far away. and again in the trenches. This is the bit I really want to just cover with it to give you some explanation. What happened was, there's Antwerp there, and these little spikes of the forts. Here, where these stars are, was where they were with the Belgian 3rd Division. Is it 3rd Division? I've not got my glasses on. 2nd Division. They were very quickly overrun, and very quick. So they forced back, and they came back to this point. They came through the city, and unlike some people's report, I do believe, and I've read a few reports on it, some people say it was a rout, but actually from what I've read, I think it was genuinely more of a fighting retreat. And then there was a big boo-boo. What happened was the command sent a runner to tell the RND to retreat. He obviously, this is before these lines, before these advances. So he did. He got as far as about here, and he gave the message to the senior officer, and he thought he'd given it to the senior officer, but he hadn't. So what he did was he retreated, and he left, and the Germans infilled and left this pocket here. So of course this lot got back, and they were safely secured behind the Allied lines. But the majority of the RND fought along this line here. There's a railway station where that was the point of assembly, but realized very quickly that it was either be taken prisoner or to become interned, or to cross the border into Holland and to be interned. And that's what they chose to do. They were interned in a place called Groningen. Again, there's a lot to be talked, I can go through quite a bit, but they were taken on, disarmed, and moved to a camp in Groningen. Okay. The camp was called HMS Timbertown, and there's some photos there of the lads. They were actually quite well treated. It's quite ironic, really. It was on an honour system. They were allowed to go ashore out in the town. Some met young ladies, some married and stayed there after the war, but they were on an honour system not to escape. Well, some did escape. Jim Burgent, the chap whose letter I read out to you, he got back. He rejoined the Navy, and he went to sea. He didn't go back in the RND, and a few of them did. And then whenever they did do that, whenever someone was known to have escaped, then leave would have been stopped, or there would have been some sort of punishment. But basically, it was done on an honour system. This is the camp, as you can see it there. It was during the Second World War. It was used as Germans used it as an army camp, and it was used as prisons. We used all sorts of things. It's an industrial estate now. That's inside one of the cabins, or one of the huts, I should say. It's interesting that so many photos are still alive. I mean, I don't think he had a bad life there, I mean, it's better than being in a trench, isn't it? With the lice and people trying to blow you up. So I guess they did okay, but it can't have been easy. So, and there we are. There's a couple of photographs of them in a snowball fight, and so like I say, it couldn't have been the worst life. Much better than being. They were fed well and well looked after. I'm going to spin through these couple now, all right, because I'm mindful of time. Just some of the other things that they took part in. Gallipoli, there's much said about the Anzacs at Gallipoli, and that's true. They played a major part, but the Royal Naval Division also played a huge part at Anzac as well. London Division won one of its Victoria Crosses there. A chap called Tinsdale St. Clair. There's the SS River Clyde. That got rammed up against the beach there, and it was a bit of a mess, wasn't it? I think we all know that. This is an intro. Again, I won't read it all out to you, but a very intro. I did a lot of research, and the Imperial War Museum recorded all these people's testaments, and thankfully they did, because they're not with us now. And this chap here is a Geordie lad, all right, Joe Murray, and he joined the RN Division. And I just want to try to reflect how intense it was. There's a photograph of the orchard. There were 60 lads at the bottom of the orchard that had to cross the orchard. In his own words, he said, there are other ways we could have gone. We could have gone round it, but we were told to go across it, and so we did. And they numbered off before they started, and there was over 60. And he recites in his commentary that he cannot remember how many people he run over and jumped over. And by the time they got to the top of the orchard, there was 3. He said, he said the bullets were so fast, they thought that the Turks had machine guns, because it was just the fire was so intense. 3 of them run. He saw somewhere at some cover. He said to the other 3, run, we'll get over there. One of them got shot. Another one went back for him. He got shot. He was the only one survived out of his group. Incredible story. But again, on the in the Imperial War Museum website, you can actually listen to some of these stories, and they are quite fascinating, especially in their own words. So again, he got his Victoria Cross by rescuing sick and wounded and injured soldiers and sailors and ferrying them back to ships. And on his last attempt, well, he didn't quite make it. Interesting fact, quick interesting fact: the Victoria Cross, you may know or may not know, well, you may or may not know, it's made out of cannons from the Battle of Waterloo. All right, the captured cannons. They used the but the blue ribbon was actually a naval one. Now it's all crimson. Okay, battle honours. Again, I won't go through it all read it all to you, but you can see there. Oh, you could see. So I'll touch the computer. The different ones there. There are others as well on top of that. In fact, where you see the Battle of Somme, there are several. You know, it breaks down into different conflicts. And there was a sarcastic Christmas card sent home from France in 1916. A couple of memorials. Okay, and some of the cap badges that were. That's the memorial at Gavrail. They're still there now. It looks like it's due with a bit of a clean. It's right in the middle of a motor. I remember passing it once. And you'll see here all the different cap badges that were worn by the different divisions within the RND. And you've got the Royal Marine Artillery as well, Royal Marine Light Artillery, and the Royal Marine, and I can't remember what that one stands for. Okay, creeping towards the end now. I'm sure you'll all be pleased to hear. That's a quick summary of the decorations that were won by HMS President during the Second World. Well, that's not true. By the Royal Naval Division during the First World War, and they're the losses as well. It was a very large division. The picture on the right hand side is the memorial, and it's at Horse Guards Parade, and it's there now. But it was moved to Greenwich, and there was a big hoo-ha, and it was there for years. And in 2003, when we had our centenary parade at Horse Guards, they brought the memorial back, and it went back to its original position. It took a few years before President started opening doors after the Second World War, after the First World War. People were sick of it. People didn't want war. They didn't want uniforms. They didn't want all that. But eventually it started again, and they started to recruit again in 1921. Now, I really am coming to the end now. I've got a little video clip to show you. In 1922, HMS President's, the ship changed. Okay, we've got a new ship. There's a gangway there now. You would notice before. There's no more smacking a dustbin lid with a stick so that come on to get you. You actually went there. And this was the first time they went onto the ship after they'd returned from the Second World War. And there's a little video clip. It's silent, I'm afraid. But it's it just brings it a little bit to life. And that's the Temple Chambers, which is just across the way, or just across the road from the embankment. The colours themselves are still at present now. There's a massive trophy cabinet in the centre of the drill hall with the Drake's drum or the divisional drum and the colours, and they're all still there now after 100 years, 100 years now, yeah. Okay, and that's where pretty well where it ends. Oh no, it doesn't. You'll see Right. And that's the embankment. The building across the way is the Temple Chambers. And there they are on the quarterdeck. It's funny to see them in the Victorian, what I consider to be almost the Victorian naval uniforms, the dress uniforms. And there we go. I think that's the end of it. Right, okay. And ladies and gentlemen, that is it. Are there any, I'll close this down. Are there any questions? I'll try and close it down. There we go.